Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. My first returning guest of the new format, Dr. Joey Munoz. Joey was very kind at being one of the sacrificial lambs to be one of the starting guests for the relaunch of the podcast back with episode 323. So if you want to go back and listen to that, great. But it's great to have you back, my friend. And now we're gonna do a masterclass on fat loss. So good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, dude. And it's an honor. I didn't know I'm actually the first one back, so that's pretty cool.
Well, there's a bunch of people I want to return with, but I figured you'd be a great fit for it because, well, your media has been spectacular. So let's go right into this.
Yeah.
Does losing body fat directly drive health improvement, or is fat loss a concurrent byproduct of what's actually driving better health?
Both. I think the healthy habits that contribute to fat loss will directly improve health, and fat loss itself will directly improve health. I think, Andrew, it's important to think about things as a hierarchy of importance. This is something that I tend to talk to clients a lot about, specifically if you work with clients who aren't super proficient when it comes to nutrition and exercise. They think about all these things they need to do. And it's like, yeah, all of them can have an impact, but let's focus on the ones that have the biggest impact, right? I'm saying that as context because I think it's very similar here. Losing body fat itself, if somebody has excess body fat, will directly positively impact health independent of how they lose that body fat. I think some people might think that's a controversial statement, but we have really good data to show that weight loss itself positively impacts health, even if you lose weight with relatively unhealthy behaviors. Now, the goal would be to have the best of both worlds, right? Lose weight in a way that's healthy. We can go into like the specific nuance of the mechanisms behind why losing adipose tissue itself contributes to improvements in health, if you'd like.
Please.
Yeah, because what I was going to say is, listen, like from a nutritional perspective, let's say somebody has high LDL cholesterol, negative health outcomes associated with dietary variables. If you, for example, reduce your saturated fat intake, if you eat slightly more fiber, if you eat a little bit more protein, these markers will improve favorably, independent of fat loss. But if we look at the hierarchy of importance, if you lose body fat, they will improve way more, right? So these variables have very small impacts compared to just overall fat loss. And that's because fat itself is a metabolically active tissue, right? So under normal healthy conditions, fat is secreting stuff into our bloodstream, right? We have things like adiponectin, which people may have heard of before. Adiponectin has general anti-inflammatory properties. So overall, we see adiponectin as like a good thing, but fat also releases other molecules that may have like inflammatory properties, things like TNF alpha, interleukin 6. The specific names of these variables don't really matter. Just know that we release things that may have potential negative impacts on health if we release too much of them, and we release things that have potential beneficial impacts on health, okay? And the ratio between those two is really important. And I emphasize that because when it comes to our physiology, very few things are just like always bad or always good. The quantity of them really matters, right? So people talk about insulin. Hey, if your insulin spikes, it's really bad. Well, guess what? If you don't have any insulin, you die. So everything exists
Cortisol.
within a range for a particular cortisol. Exactly.
Cortisol,
Yes,
great example.
exactly. So what happens when you gain excess body weight? If we look at the fat tissue itself, independent of the behaviors, right? When we grow fat, when we have more fat, fat cells themselves grow and they multiply, right? So we'll have more fat cells themselves. And what happens when they grow at an exponential rate is that our capillaries, or the blood supply to the fat tissue, can't infiltrate the fat tissue as effectively as when we have less fat, right? So we have little capillaries that pretty much infiltrate all of the different tissues in our body to supply them with oxygen and different nutrients, okay? And so when fat cells grow, when the fat tissue grows, there's less oxygen supply to the fat tissue. So the fat tissue is more hypoxic. Hypoxic means low oxygen availability. And low oxygen availability itself triggers a change in the secretory profile of the fat tissue, meaning it secretes different things. So earlier when I was saying it secretes things that are potentially good and have some anti-inflammatory properties, and it secretes things that are bad and have some potential pro-inflammatory properties. Essentially, when we have excess adipose tissue, we are going to be secreting more of the inflammatory stuff, less of the anti-inflammatory stuff, which leads to a state of chronic low-grade inflammation. Everybody talks about inflammation. Inflammation itself is not good or bad. For example, if we have a wound, we need inflammation to recover from that. What's bad is when you have a slightly elevated inflammatory state for a prolonged period of time. That's what we call chronic low-grade inflammation. It can be caused by a number of different things. Actually, different contributing factors will impact the degree to which you have chronic low-grade inflammation, but excess body fat is a major contributor. Stress is another major contributor, right? So I don't want to say like it's only fat, but fat is a big contributor. And what happens when you release more of these inflammatory molecules is that these inflammatory molecules themselves negatively impact other health markers. For example, there's mechanistic data, and I'm really good talking about more of the mechanisms when it comes to insulin resistance specifically compared to things like blood pressure, because I actually studied insulin resistance during my PhD. But essentially, these molecules, things like TNF alpha, interleukin 6, inhibit the actions of insulin. So insulin can't work correctly because these molecules are impacting its ability to work properly. And then we start to have a certain degree of insulin resistance, right? For example, in order for insulin to work properly, insulin needs to be able to bind to the insulin receptor. When we have a higher degree of chronic low-grade inflammation, insulin essentially can't bind to the receptor as effectively. It has a lower affinity. Aside from binding to the receptor, certain things happen inside the cell that are important for the function of insulin. These molecules can also negatively impact that, right? So there's a negative impact to insulin regulation. There's a negative impact to cardiovascular health. We have less worse endothelial function, essentially. So our arteries tend to become more stiff. We tend to see a greater degree of plaque buildup. So it's the chronic low-grade inflammation that's being caused by excess body fat that is contributing to the development of a lot of these adverse health outcomes. So if we just lose that body fat, independent of how we lose it, there's less of that low-grade chronic inflammation, so we see improvements in health. Hopefully that wasn't too drawn out of an answer.
No, that's fantastic. And there's something really important embedded in here as well, is we get the people who wave around the words like inflammation, cortisol, and insulin and vilify them all as causal things. We hear people talk about that inflammation is the boogeyman. It's the bad thing causing all these other problems. When, as I understand them, I think you explained pretty in a roundabout's way, they're all byproducts of the real problems, stress, excess adipose tissue. And then these things, yes, they are in context when out of control, too much of them are a bad thing, especially if it's a chronic issue. But they themselves are not the root cause. They are a byproduct of something else.
Exactly. Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and the service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps, eating out, that costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me Meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes. Perfect. Okay, do you want to go a little deeper on some of the things that we see improvements in? We know that losing excess body fat improves insulin resistance, it improves blood pressure, and it improves blood sugar. Do you want to go a little deeper on those?
Yeah. In what context specifically?
Well, improving them for improved health.
Yeah, I guess my question is
Sure.
talking about going a little bit deeper in them in the context of how it would improve health or some of the mechanisms there.
Sure. And I think we can also, if there's anything more to add about how to go, like the behaviors that will actually improve blood pressure, improve blood sugar, insulin resistance. If there's any more detail in terms of, the process of losing body fat for those things over and above just the simple act of however you lose the body fat.
Yeah, yeah. So I think if we return back to the original question of is it the behaviors or is it the body fat itself? They go hand in hand because the behaviors will drive reductions in body fat, and then the behavior themselves will have unique benefits, right? So, for example, if we talk about having high cholesterol, right?
Hmm.
There is a contribution of this chronic low-grade inflammation that we're talking about in the sense that chronic low-grade inflammation will impact how our bodies produce and metabolize cholesterol and lipids, right? So our liver might be producing more LDL, less HDL when we are in a state of chronic low-grade inflammation. So all this stuff really overlaps. It's not like inflammation causes one thing. It's like all of this stuff is happening simultaneously. So it really is all encompassing, but we could also then talk about specific behaviors like fiber, right?
Mhm.
So fiber consumption will have unique benefits on lowering cholesterol because essentially it ties up. I, I always pause because all of these variables require some baseline knowledge, but essentially we use cholesterol in our bodies to produce what's called bile, and we use bile to in the process of digesting and metabolizing fatty acids, fat from our diet, right? And we actually recycle that bile. So when we consume fiber, we actually excrete more of the bile through our feces. So when we eat more fiber, we're getting rid of more cholesterol. So our bodies have to reproduce it rather than recycle it. So these behaviors have unique impacts on health implications as well. As we mentioned, the reduction in body fat is probably going to have the biggest impact. I know we're going to talk about muscle mass as well.
Mm.
Just how I'm talking about the fact that body fat will improve these health outcomes, so will increasing muscle mass because like there are these things called myokines, which are similar to cytokines, but they're released specifically from muscle, and these have positive impacts on health overall. But I think some of the big heavy hitters, Andrew, we hit them on the head. It's improvements in blood sugar regulation, which is important, right? Reductions in liver fat, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit further on as well. Reductions in blood pressure, improvements in endothelial function, and the improvements in blood pressure happen due to a number of different things. But the big one is that as not just as we age, but as we are in worse health overall, our arteries and our blood vessels become stiffer. So they're actually pretty elastic, right? And when they're more elastic, essentially more blood can flow and there's lower blood pressure. And when they're stiffer, there's higher blood pressure. So there's improvements in the elasticity of our blood vessels. There's a reduction in blood pressure there overall. There's a reduction in blood lipids. I think those are the big three ones that most people focus on anyways. Then you could talk about like optimizing hormonal health and stuff like that. Like being obese and having excess body fat definitely negatively impacts things like testosterone and estrogen balance and all of those things, cortisol levels, but they kind of all go hand in hand. Like reductions in body fat will have a positive impact on health globally, which includes all of these different mechanisms.
All right. This is the one that might get contentious in the minds of some people. Can someone truly be healthy at a higher body fat percentage long term? Or are the examples of people who seem to be, are those outliers and almost like survivorship bias?
I think it depends on how we define healthy, man. It really does, right? Because I think as a general consensus, most people would define healthy as are your blood markers in a healthy range? Do you feel pretty good? Do you have decent energy levels? Are you not in chronic pain? It's funny because when we talk about healthy, most people talk about the blood biomarkers and they don't really consider like how they feel. And I think that's just an equally as important part of health. By that standard of definition, can you have a higher body fat and be healthy? If that's how we define fat, yes, you definitely can. That said, could you be otherwise healthier by reducing body fat? Yes. Like body fat itself is an independent risk factor for worse health, right? So if you take somebody who is obese or has excess body fat, or a high body fat percentage and they are relatively healthy based off the standard markers. If they now reduce body fat and have a normal amount of body fat, they will most likely see improvements in those health markers, right? So it's a tricky question, man. It's a tricky question because you can also argue, Andrew, that like body fat is important, but lifestyle is also really important, right? And I'm really happy that when we talk about this question, it's body fat percentage, not body weight, because we know so many people. I know we're going to be talking a little bit about skinny fat, but there's a lot of people who are it's in the scientific literature, it's called normal weight obese, which essentially means skinny fat. It's like you don't weigh a lot, but you have a very high body fat percentage. And I think there are some data comparing individuals who are higher in BMI and potentially have a slightly higher body fat percentage, but they're really active. They have a high level of muscle mass. They have a healthy diet. They exercise regularly. Compare them to somebody who is normal weight, but is not really healthy from a lifestyle perspective, don't have high muscle mass. And the health implications are not favorable for the person who's just normal weight, right? So it's a complex topic, man. In general, could you be overweight and be considered healthy based off markers? Yeah, definitely. Will that person be healthier if they reduce body fat? Yes, for sure. And I think it's hard, Andrew, to compare a group of people to another group of people because there are so many additional variables, confounding factors, and genetics play a huge role as well. That's why I like comparing a person to that same person. It's like, hey, if you take that person, they reduce body fat, they'll be healthier.
And I think it would be a very dangerous narrative. I'm getting feedback here. Dangerous narrative for someone who advocates for, let's say the health at any size sort of movement, which I think gets carried away and becomes very ideological. And there's some serious danger with some of the communicators there because of their motives. But I think if they were to take a look at the cross-section, compare the people who are engaging in healthy behavior who have higher body fat percentages to the people in the normal weight range, let's call it, nebulous term, who are unhealthy, I think that's a disingenuous comparison because I don't think you can do that to say, well, oh, look, there's all these, unhealthy people or for a variety of reasons. Therefore, comparatively being, having excess body fat is somehow comparatively healthy. I just think that is a disingenuous comparison.
Yeah. And the phrase that you can be healthy at any size is not true. It's like objectively not true. There's a cutoff, right? If you take a person and they just continue to gain weight and continue to gain weight, there will be a point where they are not healthy. Like, because like we talked about earlier, the adipose tissue itself, independent of how healthy you're living in terms of a habit and lifestyle perspective, will have negative impacts on health for sure. When we look at data, Andrew, that control for a lot of these confounding variables, like lifestyle, diet quality, sleep, alcohol intake, stress, adipose tissue is a independent contributor to negative health outcomes. So that means like independent of all the other stuff, more fat versus less fat to a certain degree as well. We're not talking about being like single digit body fat here, right?
Mm-hmm.
But having lower body fat will have positive impacts on health for sure.
There's obviously a sweet spot range, and we know that below that, it's also not healthy. And oftentimes if people are below that, outside of genetically people who just do really well at really lean body fat percentages, usually, again, the behaviors driving those lower body fat percentages, especially if they're eating disorders present, those things, very negative impacts on health. Let's do the skinny fat thing. So
sure,
we can start here is like, are obese people actually lower in muscle mass? And I want to kind of preface this because I've heard this before. And I think about it, some of the populations I work with, I do work with some people who significant weight loss. And those people have loads of muscle mass, people who are pretty big. Yeah. It's just underneath a lot of body fat. But those are also a population that are moving around. So I'm thinking that if you're actually somewhat active in your lifestyle, you have that independence, but carry a lot of body fat, I think structurally to move that around, you tend to actually have a fair bit of muscle, especially in lower body. But then you think about, okay, there's going to be people who are actually quite sedentary and very obese. And then there are the skinny fat population, people who are in a normal weight range. And I've worked with people like that before who've got NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is sort of a rising problem in that population. So can you break that all down?
Yeah. So I guess first let's address the first question of like, do obese people actually have lower muscle mass? The answer is no. Like as you mentioned, a lot of people who are overweight actually have more muscle mass. Again, let's always say this in the context of controlling for all other variables,
Hmm.
right? Because somebody might listen and be like, well, the person who's obese, who's totally sedentary, you compare them to me and I work out and I have a ton of muscle. They don't have more muscle than me. Yeah, because we're not controlling for the other variables. But if you think about what causes muscle to grow, it's stress and load, right? And what do heavier people have more of? More stress and load on their muscle mass. On their muscle mass, right? So specifically with the lower body, if you're walking around, even if you're not walking a ton, if you take two sedentary people, one, they both, let's say, get 3,000 steps per day. One has normal weight, one is heavier. The person who is heavier is most likely going to have slightly more muscle mass, right? Um, Talking about the whole skinny fat concept, uh, when we define skinny fat, just to define terms, it's somebody who, based off of BMI, is essentially not overweight, right? Like their weight is normal or healthy, but their body composition is not healthy, meaning they have low amounts of muscle mass, therefore still a very high body fat percentage, right? We could take a man who is normal weight, puts on clothes, doesn't look like they're overweight at all, but maybe they're 30% body fat, right? Again, just because they have low amounts of muscle mass. And there's really good research on this. Again, this is why it's a defined term in the research literature, like normal weight obese, because that type of subset of the population also has negative health implications. And Andrew, I think it's because, like, yes, as I mentioned earlier, adipose tissue is a unique contributor to negative health outcomes. But I really do think, and personally, I will be clear up this up front, I haven't looked too deeply at the data on this, but I think it has more to do with the ratio of muscle to fat mass that somebody has, right? That really is a very important factor because if you have low amounts of muscle mass, you are going to have negative health outcomes, both from a blood biomarker perspective as well from a physical perspective. Like you might experience more pain and discomfort, less ability to do things physically, right? So the muscle mass component is incredibly important. I want to take a pause because I want to make sure that I come back to the original question, which was, do fat people or do people with more body fat, can't call people fat anymore, but do people with more body fat have less muscle mass? Not at all. Is being normal weight enough? No, because the whole skinny fat thing definitely has negative implications on health. And where do you want to take this question from here?
Let's see. Well, how dangerous is it to be skinny
Yeah,
fat?
that's a good question. And I think it's pretty dangerous, right? I think you had also brought up the concept of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and we can definitely
Yes.
tackle that too. Um, but it's pretty dangerous. First off, muscle itself is the biggest reservoir for sugar in our blood, right? So we store glucose as glycogen. We store some in the liver, but then we can store a whole ton in muscle mass. So essentially, the more muscle we have, the better our bodies are at handling glucose. And these topics are nuanced, Andrew, because glucose itself isn't inherently bad. It also depends on like the caloric load of the person, right? Like, are they at energy balance versus a surplus? Because if you're a normal energy balance or a negative energy balance, even if a larger proportion of your caloric intake is coming from sugar itself, it doesn't seem to like directly have negative health implications outside of the total caloric load. But in general, more muscle, your body handles glucose better, so better insulin sensitivity. On top of that, muscle contraction itself helps you lower your blood sugar without needing insulin. So as I mentioned earlier, like insulin binds to muscles, and that allows for your muscles to take up sugar from the blood. So it lowers blood sugar, and then the sugar goes into the muscle cell, right? Simplified version there. So in general, that's what we call an insulin dependent mechanism. We need insulin to take sugar from our blood into our muscle, but we can also do it in a insulin independent mechanism. So muscle contraction stimulates the movement of a protein. It's called a glucose transporter. So there are these small little proteins called glucose transporters. The glucose transporter 4, there's a bunch of them, lives inside the muscle cell. essentially when insulin binds to the muscle cell, it signals for that glucose transporter to move to the outside of the muscle cell. So now glucose can come inside of it. So as the name implies, glucose transporter, it's necessary to transport glucose inside the cell. But when muscle contracts, it also stimulates the glucose transporter to come to the outer portion of the cell, essentially, to allow glucose to come into the cell. So it lowers your body's need to like secrete a bunch of insulin. We could also then go into like other things that we haven't talked about, like reductions in risk of cancer and Alzheimer's and things like arthritis, right? Like all of this is associated with muscle mass. And where my knowledge gaps exist a little bit, Andrew, is like how much of that is driven through muscle mass itself versus the behaviors, right? Because another thing we see, Andrew, is like muscle mass is important, but there's a reason why we don't see positive health outcomes in bodybuilders that have like ridiculous amounts of muscle mass compared to somebody who has normal amounts of muscle mass. So I do think there's an impact of the behaviors themselves, right? Of like the stress that you're implying on your body from exercise itself, independent of how much muscle mass you have. It's like, I forget who made this. I think it was Lauren Colenso Semple. I always say her last name incorrectly.
No, that's right.
But she made a post talking about like how people are going crazy about grip strength, right? And it's like, I need to train my grip. I need to train my grip because grip strength is associated with longevity. And it's not that like making your grip stronger is going to help you live longer. It's that people who live longer are generally active, they're strong, so they have higher grip strength as a byproduct. It's like the chicken or the egg type of thing, right? I think it's a similar concept here. But in terms of, to bring it back to the question, man, how dangerous it is, depends on how big of a risk you like to take in life. But if you want to reduce your risk of chronic disease as much as possible, focusing on optimizing muscle mass is very important and will definitely have positive impacts on reducing your risk of dying.
Is there any more depth to, because I know that NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, is something we're starting to talk more about. I know that Peter Attia did a pretty good job of going in depth in outlay of his book. Is there anything else you want people to know about behaviors, lifestyle that could actually reduce their risk of developing it, or anything about how it manifests and why it's more prevalent now?
Sure. That's a really good question. So essentially, NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, simply referring to an increase in fat in the liver itself, right? And it's primarily driven through a lot of the things that we've been talking about, man. Okay, so from lifestyle factors, excess caloric intake, for sure, right? Like excess caloric intake drives the accumulation of fat, and we store some fat as fatty tissue, adipose tissue, and we store some fat as liver fat, right? And so it's kind of like a bi-directional loop because, and this is how I like to explain it. It's like eating an excess energy is going to contribute to increases in liver fat, and then liver fat itself contributes to insulin resistance, and then that itself drives more fat in the liver, right? So it's like they both negatively impact each other. But beyond caloric intake, man, like all of the stuff we always talk about, it's hard when you ask me this question of like what lifestyle factors, because I feel like it's something that's repeated so much, like good sleep, reducing stress, or managing stress, I should say, reducing alcohol intake, but we're talking about non-alcoholic fatty liver here. Being active, because as we talked about earlier, muscle itself is so incredibly important, right? But a lot of these things, Andrew, have these positive impacts because it comes down to overall reducing chronic inflammation in many ways. I know like this word inflammation gets thrown around a lot, but there is some truth to it in the sense that it does seem like chronic low-grade inflammation is at least a partial contributor to most chronic diseases, right? And is it, again, the chicken or the egg? Is it causal? Is it correlational? We definitely know that mechanistically there's a causal impact for sure. So anything that's going to help you just live a healthier lifestyle will have positive impacts on liver fat as well. I say that, Andrew, because when, people talk a lot about visceral fat and all this stuff, visceral fat, we're talking about fatty liver here, but there's nothing unique that you need to do to just reduce your liver fat. Beyond living a healthier lifestyle, I think from a nutritional perspective, the most important thing is really going to be fiber more than anything else. If we try to pinpoint one thing, like I don't know the percentage, but it's a very large percentage of Americans specifically that don't meet basic fiber recommendations. So those would be the big ones, man. Appropriate sleep, regular exercise. I'm biased. I definitely think that resistance training has so many unique benefits that cardiovascular exercise doesn't offer. Again, it's not one or the other. You should do both. But if you're limited on time, I would definitely encourage more resistance training for the strength and muscle side of things. Managing stress well, making sure you're not skinny fat, have good body composition, making sure you have an overall healthy diet. When we talk about the stress component, Andrew, we could go in a completely different tangent here and talk about aspects of health that are so important besides just what you do physically and what you eat. Like having a healthy social circle and like relationships and all of those things are incredibly important as well. I don't know much of the science there beyond. I know that it's important.
Well, I'm actually going to do as long as everything works out, Dr. Ben Rein, R-E-I-N, he released a book, and I want to make sure I got the title right. It's out now. It's called, I'm pretty sure it's Why Brains Need Friends. And so that gets into the neuroscience of social connection, loneliness, isolation, these sort of things, and the negative health impacts. So I'm going to do a very deep dive in the very near future for everybody listening. So that one we're going to cover. I would love a little bit more of your thoughts on the relationship between, let's say, poor nutrition and Alzheimer's disease risk. I'm comfortable, I think at this point, with everybody. We know that excess body fat and the behaviors that tend to lead to that, inactivity and overconsumption of calories, increase risk of cardiovascular disease. It increases risks of some type of cancers. And very obviously, there's a very direct relationship with type 2 diabetes. But we're hearing more about Alzheimer's disease, neurodegenerative diseases, and some people are referring to it as type 3 diabetes. So, got anything to offer there?
Dude, to be completely honest, this specific to brain health, this is definitely completely outside of my scope in the sense that I do not know much, but I will say this. It is very unlikely driven by any specific nutritional variables.
Okay.
And I know people like to talk about this a lot, and the whole type 3 diabetes is because of sugar dysregulation, essentially. But even when we talk about type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and the thing is, people like to make this very direct link of, if you're diabetic, you have high blood sugar because you have insulin resistance, so you shouldn't eat sugar. And it's it just doesn't work that way, man. It doesn't work that way because this stuff is complicated and there's so much overlap, right? And it depends on the context. So it's hard to say that any particular nutritional variable contributes to Alzheimer's, for example, or even diabetes, man, because it's people want to talk about simple carbohydrates. And it's yeah, but if we don't talk about the context of energy balance, it just does not matter. It just does not matter, right? And then people talk about low carb intake so that you can regulate your blood sugar. And ironically, high fat intake actually negatively impacts insulin signaling, right? So beyond that, I really don't feel super comfortable talking on this topic because I just don't know the etiology of brain-related diseases as I do with some of the more common diseases like diabetes and stuff like that. But I can strongly say that it's definitely not driven by any singular particular nutrition-related variable.
And that answers almost the best thing I can have listeners hear, because we don't always hear people, let's call them experts, people with high degrees of education, a PhD in a specific topic, often say exactly what you did. I've had recent guests on. Holly Baxter does a wonderful job at any time that she does not feel like she knows the evidence on something. She'll sort of say the exact same disclaimer. And we should be looking for that more with our authorities. Whereas there are to me, usually a big red flag is someone with a PhD or a high degree of education who has turned themselves into a science communicator in a broad sense. They become a science communicating talking head. They're out on the podcast circuit or themselves have podcasts, and they speak very confidently about a wide variety of topics that their education, didn't cover. Now, it's very possible that some of them may have actually acquired significant expertise. I'll give you a great example. My friend Brad Dieter was on the podcast not terribly long ago. Brad's PhD is actually in exercise science, but his level of education in nutrition. He owns a great nutrition company, and I am comfortable knowing his expertise in nutrition. I'll talk to him any day on that topic as well. But there are a lot of people who I know just very wildly outside their area of expertise. Little bit of a side quest there, but I think it's really important for people here. So let's go back, because I did mention, some cancers. And our friend, Dr. Joe Zundell, is great with this. I had him on a while ago. We talked about the relationship between cancer and lifestyle, but are there any things that you're comfortable saying about behavior, adiposity, nutrition, et cetera, that some types of cancers that are now higher risk for people?
This episode is brought to you by Macros First. I've always struggled with nutrition tracking apps, even the slightest hassle or friction, and it breaks my habit. That changed with Macros First. When I tried it, I told my friend, the founder, Jacob, quote, this is, well, let's just call it a certain other app on steroids. It's the easiest app to use, and it has a free barcode scanner, which if you use tracking apps, you know this is a really big deal. I recommend Macros First to all my clients and friends, and even had them sponsor my 2024 conference. Here's an example feature I love: auto-calculate food portions. Let's say you've got 30 grams of protein left for the day, and you're thinking, how much chicken breast do I need to hit that? In other apps, you're left guessing serving sizes, hoping you get close to your 30-gram goal. With Macros First, just tell it the target you want to hit, and it tells you exactly how much to eat. No more macro Tetris. Other apps ask, how much do you eat? Macros First also lets you ask, how much should I eat? And while Macros First's premium version is incredible for any user, the basic version, which is nowhere near basic, is free to use. So you can go to either the Apple Store or Google Play to download.
Yeah, there's definitely a direct link with, first off, adiposity and most types of cancers overall, right? But if we talk about specific nutritional links to cancer, we know that like high red meat consumption is associated with an increased risk of prostate cancer, for example, right? Adiposity and liver cancer, for example. This stuff is nuanced, man, because there's definitely a link with like red meat consumption and prostate cancer, and we're seeing incredibly like elevated rates of prostate cancer in younger adults now than we ever have. And the thing is, Andrew, that like the science as to why these things happen always takes a lot longer to discover than just discovering the fact that it's actually happening, right? So I think a lot of people postulate it may be this, it may be that. It's hard to really know. But I do know that a lot of the research that looks at links between specific foods or food groups and health outcomes, it's really hard to determine a causal factor because there's so many variables that impact this. I keep saying this over and over because it's just so true. Like even with red meat consumption, it just depends, man, on like the quality of the meat that you're consuming, the quantity, obviously. It depends on so many other variables as well. Because one thing you hear often, Andrew, is like, this increases the risk of this. But we never talk about how much. And that's really important as well. Because let's be honest, none of us are perfect, and we all do stuff in our day-to-day life that has negative health implications. That's first and foremost, right? And I say that explicitly, man, because if I ever post a video of like me eating something or drinking something, like for example, do I know that red meat is linked to some adverse health outcomes? Yeah, I eat red meat every day. Why? Because I love it. And it's a lean source of protein. I'm getting pretty lean protein, low saturated fat. I don't burn the hell out of my meat. There's so many contributing factors. But like I do it because I understand it may carry some risk, but I enjoy it, right? And I bring this up because going back to the relative risk stuff of red meat and prostate cancer, for example, I think if I'm not wrong here, I might be slightly off on the specific percentage, but there is a 20% increase in the relative risk of prostate cancer when you consume, I can't remember the quantity, but it's a fairly low amount of red meat on a regular basis. And 20% sounds really scary, but it's relative risk. So it's 20% increased risk of your baseline risk. And I think lifetime risk of prostate cancer is something around 15-ish%. I could be wrong about the specific number there as well, but let's say it's 15%. So it's a 20% increase of 15%, right? Which is about 3%. So it goes from 15% risk to about 18% risk, which is not insignificant, but it's a lot less scary than 20%, right? So all this stuff it is really nuanced, man. Yeah, I feel like I'm deviating there.
No, that's fine. And while I'm confident that a fair bit of the research controls for other lifestyle factors, I I feel very confident in saying this. Here I am, maybe wandering outside of my area of expertise, but I am of the understanding that across populations, people who consume a lot of red meat, there's also higher levels of alcohol consumption, higher rates of smoking, and certain other lifestyle behaviors that are, well, very demonstrably negative, right?
Yeah, and the difficult part, man, is like to look at something like cancer risk. You can't do a double-blind controlled placebo trial because you can't like control people's lives for years on end because it takes years to develop something like cancer, right? We do know, though, based off cross-sectional data, that if you add additional variables into the analyses, such as total fruit and vegetable consumption, which we know is healthy, we do see reductions in that elevated risk of cancers, particularly prostate cancer, even in higher meat consumers, right? So the question is it is it high amounts of red meat that are directly causing negative health impacts, or is it that these people are eating potentially so much red meat that they're not eating other stuff that's really healthy? Is it like red meat that's really high in saturated fat? Because that's a variable as well. Is it that people are charring the hell out of their meat? And we know that when you char it, you're producing carcinogenic compounds, right? So there's so many variables here. But what I was going back to is that when we look at higher meat consumers, and the issue here, Andrew, is that even in the research literature, when they categorize low and high meat consumers, the high meat consumers are still not really high meat consumers. They're having like a couple servings a week. Like it's not a high meat consumer, right? But regardless, when you take low meat consumers versus high meat consumers, there's a higher risk in the high meat consumers. But now when you look at low meat consumers with low fruit and vegetable consumption versus high meat consumers with high fruit and vegetable consumption, that elevated risk almost disappears. If I'm not incorrect here, completely disappears. Meaning that it's not just the meat, right? There's a lot of these variables that play a role as well. So what you mentioned is definitely true.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's make sure we cover one more thing too. I like bringing this up a lot because, you know, as I get older, I'm concerned with it. I work with older adults. It's the relationship between muscle mass and having strength, power, bone density, and fall injury prevention risk. So do you have any, you know, added nuance to the role of muscle mass there? And perhaps even, I don't know if you know the data on this, this might be a reach, but if we also have people who are simply heavier and higher levels of body fat percentage, are they at increased risk of fall injury risk due to, especially when we get that combination of people who maybe are weaker, not as active, high levels of body fat, do they fall more easily? Take that anywhere you want that you feel confident.
Yeah. Yes, you may not know this. My PhD was on the effects of prunes on bone density in older adults because we were doing a lot of work in osteopenic men. I think I might have shared that the first time. I don't remember. I didn't want to bring up something that I totally blanked on earlier when you were talking about specific nutritional factors that may positively impact health, because I was just thinking about it from negative health implications. And I do want to talk about some of the unique benefits of like plant-based foods. But really quick to address this question, because I'm actually making a video about this week. Individuals with low muscle mass and low muscle function, and function in this particular study was determined as like their ability to sit and stand a certain number of times within 60 minutes in a chair, right? I don't remember the specific cutoff, but if you were below a specific number of times of squatting essentially in a minute, it was considered low muscle function. So older adults with low muscle function and low muscle size were 12 times more likely to lose their independence later in life. So needing assistance to live, right? Take a shower, take a shit, like getting in and out of bed. Literally just predicted by low muscle size and low muscle function. To translate that to a percentage, that's 1,200% greater risk of losing your independence. So significantly greater risk. It's very, very, very important. And there's a direct correlation between strength and muscle density, not muscle density, bone density as well, right? When we're talking about risk of fracture from a fall, it comes down to two things: your risk of falling, which comes down to having low muscle mass and essentially and power and reactivity as well, right? But all of these things, as we know, go hand in hand. You're not going to have high muscle mass and super low power and super low reactivity, because they go hand in hand. They're trained fairly effectively. And you could correct me there if there's some nuance.
Well,
But
funny because the added nuance at high levels is literally
okay.
the last episode with Christian Thibodeau. He actually goes really deep into, the neurological recruitment of muscle and where we see the component of strength, that is the baseline of actually muscle, and then how much of it is actually the neurological efficiency of recruiting or existing muscle. It's a fucking masterclass. If you guys are interested in this stuff, last episode, Christian Thibodeau, the guy's a god at this stuff. So that'll cover that.
Okay, cool. But okay, first we talk about risk of falling. And a big part of it is strength related, right? But regardless, lower muscle mass, lower strength, lower reactivity, higher risk of falling. And now the issue is, once you fall, what's your risk of actually breaking a bone? And that comes down to bone density, right? And strength and bone density are directly correlated, simply because your bones respond to stress very similarly as muscle does, right? Like your bones get stronger if you place load on them, which is just our body's natural ability to build resilience to stress, right? So I actually have not seen data, Andrew, comparing like obese older adults versus leaner older adults. In general, we don't see very many obese old adults. Late 70s, 80s, 90s, it's not that common, right? Because of all of the other negative implications that we talked about earlier, unfortunately. Either they lose weight and live a little bit longer, or a lot of people pass away because of body weight related complications. But I think if we use a certain degree of logic here, we can extrapolate and say that if somebody is significantly overweight and falls, they likely do have a slightly lower risk of breaking a bone. They probably have slightly higher bone density because they have more stress on their bones. And then beyond that, there's a certain amount of cushion being provided by the adipose tissue where all of that stress is going to be placed just on the bone, right? So I guess you could say that's one positive effect.
And I think that muddies up the data on this because, again, I'm not a master of this data, but I think it's kind of inconclusive, especially at moderate levels of muscle and body fat. I'm very comfortable saying stronger bones, stronger muscles, definitely significantly more resilient against a fall fracture injury, a serious one. But as to whether or not the extra adipose tissue and cushioning, logically speaking, I agree. It's something that will cushion the fall. And it could be one of those situations where you have someone who is smaller, low body fat, and let's say frail, but I think the frailty of bone and muscle is the really big contributing factor. And if they don't have much cushioning on top of it, I'm comfortable thinking that those people are at a much higher risk of falling and breaking something and all of the negative stuff that comes from that. So yeah, I think that kind of covers the nuance. I don't think anyone wants to risk it. I think maintain as much muscle, bone as possible, stay strong. And again, we talked about this with Christian in the last episode, the speed and power as you age, those decline faster than muscle, than bone strength. And if you fall, and hey, listen, I've been there, right? Anybody who's listened to the podcast for a while, like a year and a half ago, I slipped on my stairs. I love joking about carpet and socks on stairs. It's just a really bad combo. And anecdotally, I've heard that plenty of people have been found dead at the bottom of the stairs with that combo, and it might just be like a fall, the injury, death. But anyway, it scared the shit out of me. I fell, my legs came out from under me, one kind of buckled back under, and I landed, and I'm heavy. And I actually sprained my ACL in the process, and it's not 100%, but it's significantly improved. But boy, did that ever scare the shit out of me. But again, like I've actually fallen other times. I've fallen on the stairs numerous times. I have this bad habit of taking stairs really fast. I more or less changed it. I hold the handrail. I know this sounds ridiculous, but I've fallen, and because I'm quick and I, muscle and power and what have you, I usually am able to catch myself, whether it's my hands hit the ground really quickly or grab a guardrail or something. But you lose that, and you're far more likely to actually fall and have a hard impact on your hip, on your legs, your knees, etc. So I'm a big advocate: speed, power, explosive training as we age.
Yeah. And the other thing I was going to touch on is because you were mentioning like older adults who maybe are very low body fat, lower muscle mass versus one who has a little bit more body fat, a little more muscle mass. Again, we have to talk about like these things as a range, right? Because like excess body fat, not good, but very low, also very bad. And then older adults who tend to have very low amounts of body fat, it's because they're pretty frail and they're undernourished, right? So they're deficient in particular nutrients that are important for things like bone density. This actually kind of brings me back to what I wanted to interject that I forgot earlier, is that I am of the not I'm not of the belief. I think that the data clearly show that all food groups have unique health benefits. And I think it's silly to cut out any particular food group for any reason besides the fact that you have a sensitivity or an allergy to it, right? And I say that because there's all of these different diet camps where it's like, don't eat fruits because of this, don't eat meat because of that. Like, I think, I won't say as bad, but somebody who goes carnivore and cuts out all plant-based foods is going to miss out on the health benefits of plant-based foods the same way a vegan is going to miss out on some of the health benefits of animal-based foods, right? And I bring this up because if we talk about some of the foods that have the most unique benefits that we don't eat enough of, it really is vegetables. Like, people don't eat enough vegetables. And we think it's just because of the micronutrients and the fiber. It's like, oh, I could take a fiber supplement and I can take a multivitamin. And that is a big part of it, but it goes well beyond that. And I'm not talking about here from like satiety and hunger to help you lose weight, but plants are filled with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different molecules that we classify as phytochemicals, which essentially are molecules found in plants. We've studied some of them. They seem to have potential positive impacts on health outside of weight loss. And you don't get those things with a multivitamin, right? You just don't. And I'm kind of shooting myself here for getting this earlier because this is like all I studied in my PhD. We would study a lot of the health promoting effects of specific plant-based foods outside of just their micronutrient composition. And we used to do this by having a matched control that was just like a multivitamin that matched the nutritional profile of the food. But for example, beans, all sorts of beans have particular types of phytochemicals that seem to have unique benefits for cardiovascular health and prevent plaque buildup and atherosclerosis, right? We were looking at the impacts of something called bitter melon on blood sugar regulation. Like, plant-based foods are just so rich in so many compounds that we like don't even really know what impacts they have yet, beyond the fact that overall, time and time again, when people eat more plants, they have better health outcomes, and it goes beyond just weight and like what their micronutrients are. And when we talk about micronutrients here, Andrew, we're talking about vitamins and minerals. Minerals, we kind of know everything there because they're just basic elements. But when it comes to vitamins, the vitamins that we classify as essential, it's because we need these to actually survive. And if we don't have them, we die because it causes deficiency. But a lot of these things have vitamin-like properties. We just don't classify them as essential because you're not going to die tomorrow if you don't have it, right? But the research is pretty clear that they do have very positive impacts on health.
You're not going to get rickets.
No.
A quick sponsor break for my current aspiring coach listeners. This episode is brought to you by Train Heroic. If you know me, you know I only work with sponsors I use personally and where I know the people behind the product. Train Heroic is the best online coaching software in the industry. Not only is it a great platform for one-on-one coaching, it's fantastic for group coaching and selling standalone programs. Train Heroic is used by some of my trusted friends, so I switched my online group program here, and my members love it, raving about its ease of use. Having a dedicated app means far greater reliability for my clients and has been by far my best experience with any online coaching software. Train Heroic is a proven and stable industry leader, meaning it isn't going to suddenly disappear. One of the biggest risks in choosing an online coaching software. When you start a free trial today, you'll get 90 days free to experience why I love and trust this platform. You'll get full support from their team, who've been a joy for me to work with. I trust Train Heroic and the people behind it. Use my link, www.trainheroic.com/liftfree to start your 90-day free trial, or go to the link in the show notes. I'll leave off there. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joey Munoz, I want everybody to go follow you if they're not already. Instagram at dr.joeymunoz. Okay. Anywhere else you want to send people? Any other resources you want to share?
My podcast, the Dr. Joey Munoz Show. I don't know if I said this the first time, but I spent like 2 weeks trying to come up with a creative name, man. I was like, I just can't figure it out. I'll just name it the Dr. Joey Munoz Show. But yeah, my podcast is way more focused on body composition and fat loss tips and sustainability, since that's what I tend to focus on. So if you're interested in that, go check it out.
So quick side quest here.
Yeah.
Podcast naming, there is something to this. And people both they think my podcast name is quite clever and I love it, but it's actually a terrible podcast name because it doesn't have a high searchability. So I trade off. Yeah, I trade off the fact that you guys, and here's the call to action, will take this and share it with someone in your world. So that way more people find Joey, they find these masterclass topics, my show, and the guests that I'm going to continue to bring on. So you guys help me that way. Yes, I think that what you and I both rely on to a degree is our other media driving attention to the podcast. But our listeners, you guys, and sharing it with the people in your world is the key factor there. If anybody decides that they really want to start a podcast, number one is actually, I'm going to give a shout to my producer because he's a beauty. Chris Little, he's the one who does all the back end stuff. He does all the slides. He's the one who puts together all the ads. And I couldn't do this stuff without him. He's great. He's got his own podcast, but he's also got courses and he will answer your questions if you guys are literally interested in podcasting. He's great at this stuff. So go check him out. Just search Christian Little on Instagram. I followed him. You'll find him. He's so super. And yeah, it's definitely a challenge in this space because there's not a lot of organic discoverability. But in the meantime, guys, go follow Joey. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate everybody.